you been? Okay.
Good morning. I'm Hale Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program. Welcome to the Wilson Center and to today's meeting on the Palestinians and their politics. This is the first in a series of 4 meetings, and we hope that you will be able to attend all 4 meetings. This conference is jointly sponsored by the Joseph and Alma Gildenhorn Middle East Forum at the Wilson Center and the International Crisis Group. The Wilson Center, a living memorial to President Wilson, is a non-partisan institution. The center maintains a neutral forum for free, open, and informed dialogue. The series we are launching today is a testimony to this goal. The International Crisis Group, the series co-sponsor, is a conflict prevention organization that works through field-based analysis and research and produces reports with practical recommendations targeted at key decision makers. You can pick up copies of the reports put up by the ICG on your way out. I'm going to invite now the chairman of the Woodrow Wilson Center Board of Trustees, Ambassador Joseph Gildenhorn, to open today's meeting. Please close your cell phones. Thank you. Joe?
Thank you, Hala, and good morning, everyone. My wife, Alma, who's here today, and I were pleased to start the Joseph and Alma Gildenhorn Middle East Forum in the year 2004, and it was established to explore and discuss opportunities and means for the resolution of regional conflicts, including, but just not limited to, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Today's meeting will be moderated by Robert Malley, Director of Middle East and North Africa Program at the International Crisis Group, and Aaron David Miller, a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. Rob and Aaron have been collaborating for almost a decade on Middle East matters, while they were both in and out of government. Their ongoing free, open, and serious discussions and occasional differences have brought clarity and honesty to the critical issues needed to reach an Arab-Israeli peace accord. It is clear that America's current foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, also needs such clarity and honesty. Our conference today, the first in a series of 4 over the course of the next year, is designed to examine various perspectives on prospects for Arab-Israeli peacemaking. There will be an emphasis on the changes that have occurred in recent years and what impact those changes have had on the calculations of Arabs, Israelis, and Palestinians, and of course on American policy. Clearly, the focus today is on the upcoming meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, scheduled for later this fall. By any standard, given the expectations and the stakes, it will be a critical summit in determining what and how much is possible in Arab-Israeli peacemaking during the remainder of the Bush administration. But before we can identify an effective and needed American role and policy in resolving the conflict, it is imperative that we understand without illusion the politics, needs, and requirements of the parties themselves. I am certain that these jointly sponsored Wilson Center and ICG programs will contribute to that end. This meeting is very much in the Wilsonian tradition, discussing key public policy issues, bringing a variety of viewpoints to the table, and having a civil and serious discussion that can advance and contribute to the important and positive policy deliberations. I would now like to call on Robert Malley to start the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. Thank you for that introduction. As you just heard, this is a collaborative effort between the Wilson Center and the International Crisis Group, the first in a series of 4 seminars, panels, in which we're going to discuss something that very often is ignored, which is what's happening within the political entities that are involved in the peace process. The next series will be devoted to the Israeli arena, and just to give you a preview, our three guests will be Nahum Barnea, Dov Weissglass, and Yehuda Ben Meir, and that will be in late January, but we'll give you notice ahead of time. So what we're talking about in these sessions are the domestic constraints, domestic realities, and their impact on potential peacemaking in the region. Today, we're going to be talking about the Palestinians, and we have with us three of the foremost experts on Palestinian affairs, Palestinian history, Palestinian politics, Palestinian public opinion. And those are the issues that we're going to explore today with Yazid Saig. And you have the bios in the files that were outside, so I really won't go into any detail, but just to give you very, very brief highlights. With Yazid Saig, we have the author of probably the best history, I will say the best history of the Palestinian national movement. And he's going to be talking to us about what's happening in the Palestinian national movement in a historical and broader perspective, given the very significant developments of the past several years. Khalil Shikaki, who I'm sure most of you know because he's familiar in the United States, will be talking, is an expert on Palestinian public opinion, the foremost Palestinian pollster, and he'll be talking to us about what's happening within Fatah, within Hamas, within Palestinian public opinion at large. And then finally, Mustafa Barghouti, who was, there's too much in his history for me to summarize. Suffice it to say that he was Minister of Information in the short-lived National Unity Government. He is the head of the Palestinian National Initiative. He's an independent Palestinian political actor, and he's going to be talking to us about how the developments in Palestinian politics, what's happening today between Hamas and Fatah, and how it may impact the peace process. So without further ado, we're going to have all three of the speakers in the order I just described make their presentations, maximum about 15 minutes each. Then we'll open up to questions. Aaron will be moderating that section, and you'll have plenty of opportunity to ask whatever is on your mind. So Yazid, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here. My first visit, unlike Khalil, to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I think unlike Mustafa.
No, I'm black.
Yeah? Well, you've been around Washington now. The central argument here is that Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the horses and all the men of several kings haven't been able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again and will not be able to do so. And by Humpty Dumpty, I mean two things, one of which I won't discuss, but I know Mustafa will, and that is the peace process, the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. I don't see being put back together again in a productive way. But what I'm going to focus on today is the Palestinian political system. This is broken, and I think that is a fundamental problem which prevents Palestinians from taking the political initiative, re-knitting, rebuilding their internal dynamics, internal politics, taking control of events, stopping and maybe even reversing the militarization of Palestinian domestic politics that we've seen this year very vividly. Without a political system, a viable political system, nothing better will happen. And what do I mean by a political system? I mean both the formal and the informal structures, procedures, processes, rules of the game, as it were, that bring together disparate groups of people in any society according to agreed understandings about how to conduct the business of politics among themselves. Now, whether this is conducted through formal processes such as elections and unfolds in a parliament or some such formal structure, or it occurs through the meeting of different political parties and political leaders who then set understandings for what to do, what not to do, how far to go in their disputes, what to agree on. However you want to define a political system, this is broken in the Palestinian case. What has happened between Fatah and Hamas, I believe, has gone beyond the ability of these two major parties in Palestinian politics to put back together again. Now, there are a number of different factors. I was told just before the talk that I had 10 minutes instead of 15, so I hurriedly sort of cut and paste what I could. Basically, I'm going to focus on two or three main factors that I think explain how this has come about and, more importantly, why it won't get better. First, if we look at Fatah and Hamas, their internal politics, and Khalil will be speaking more about this later on, so I won't go into much detail, but fundamentally I think both suffer fundamental problems. They have internal dynamics that are counterproductive or dysfunctional, and that Fatah in particular long ago lost the ability to bypass, to get beyond. In other words, effectively Fatah does not exist, to my mind, and has not for many years as a single coherent organization. It had coherence to the extent that it ruled, that it held power, and therefore used power in order to circulate patronage within a broad number of people affiliated to the movement and affiliated to the president, Arafat. And with the loss of power, with the loss of Arafat as well, with long years of neglect and fragmentation, quite deliberate by Arafat, what was left was a shambles. What was left was fragments, dispersed and scattered, unable to come together on any single issue, agenda, or platform, other possibly than the desire to return to power in order to restore access to privileges and to patronage. This is not to say that no one in Fatah doesn't have better ideas than that, but you can't say that Fatah as a whole has a common theme or a common platform. And the fact that Fatah officially is committed to a two-state solution based on an approximation of the 1967 borders, etc., that is true and valid and important, but it doesn't translate organizationally into a functional political organization that can determine what to do about someone like Hamas, what to do about power, what to do about elections, what to do about any particular thing. There is no effective, coherent decision-making process within Fatah. Hamas has clearly been far better organized, disciplined, and capable in terms of conducting an internal political debate about key issues and taking decisions and then acting upon them. And yet, it too, I think, is stuck in a very severe dilemma or quandary, partly because it, to my mind, certainly, has brought about many of the conditions that the Palestinians suffer today through its transfer of the battle against the Israeli occupation across the Green Line into Israel proper, with targeting civilians, with suicide bombings. It's contributed in a massive way to the unraveling of all that had been achieved by the Palestinian national movement in the previous 30 years. And that's a reality that it hasn't acknowledged, of course, will not acknowledge. It speaks of victory, of expelling the Israelis from Gaza and so on, while overlooking the fact that the Israelis in the meantime have taken over more of the West Bank, have created new fait accompli with the security barrier, effectively cordoned off all of East Jerusalem. And the Palestinians strategically are in a terrible position, and Hamas has contributed to this outcome. Not alone, certainly, but it has done so. And its problem is that it, on the one hand, does, I believe, most of its members and leaders accept that they will become part of a two-state negotiated solution with Israel. That isn't their big dilemma, although there will be a problem of coming to the moment of truth and saying so, and they will have people who reject that from within their ranks. But the bigger dilemma is, can they offer anything to the Palestinians or to themselves that Fatah didn't offer in the past? I mean, fundamentally, we're back to a two-state solution with an approximation of the 1967 borders, some sort of arrangement for refugees in Jerusalem. Hamas can't actually bring about much better than Fatah was trying to bring about. And moreover, when it comes to the means, i.e., do you negotiate with the Israelis directly or indirectly? Do you do so through the roadmap or some other framework? The fundamentals aren't really any different. There are issues of security, whether the Palestinians will cease violence or not against Israel, and all these are the same old issues. So Hamas hasn't come up with any real solutions to these fundamental questions, and the only solutions they can push, I think, are going to be the same ones that Fatah was operating with. Whether Hamas can be maybe more effective, establish a deterrence, say that we won't play by the old rules of the game where Israel can do what it wants and we can't. There, I think Hamas has tried to create some sort of margin for maneuver. But ultimately, it's now stuck in a new status quo where it doesn't have really effective levers except to resort to more violence, which I think it recognizes as counterproductive for its purpose. So Hamas, I don't think, has any real prospect in that respect. And I know, again, Khalil will speak more about the internal problems within Hamas. Now, the other broader issue is that I'm describing, or I started out with Humpty Dumpty, describing not just the breaking of a political system. We're looking at what I think anywhere else in the world would be called conditions of a failed state in Palestine. We've got massive economic meltdown, unemployment, poverty, food insecurity. Well over half the population is food insecure. Something like 1.1 million people by June in Gaza out of 1.4 million were dependent on food aid. When you translate this as well into the West Bank, how many people live at, below, or near the poverty line? We're talking about 60% or more of the entire population, and more in some locations. The damage to the social fabric has been enormous. I don't think people are focusing much, but they should, on things like domestic violence, on the dropping level of, things like divorce rates and what age people get married at, all these things that we don't tend to look at in violent conflicts, but are very significant indicators of the stress that a society is subjected to. And with the breaking of the political system and the fact that the Palestinian Authority ceased to be an effective governing institution, to my mind, from the day after the guns came out in October 2000, and certainly with the reoccupation of the West Bank in 2002, and then with what happened following Hamas's election victory and the inability and unwillingness of Fatah to come to terms with its electoral loss, and the fact that the United States administration in particular pursued a regime change strategy that has helped bring about this deep division within the constitutional system of Palestine and the violent rupture to which the Israelis, the Americans, and Fatah themselves contributed to at least as much, if not, in fact, significantly more than Hamas, to my mind. Now, so under conditions of a failed state, basically, this is what we're describing. Ineffective institutions, lack of governance, lack of insecurity, constant violence. Who is going to come out and create order, stability, rebuild institutions? Institutions need to be self-maintaining, self-sustaining. They need to be autonomous as well. We don't see these sorts of institutions. In fact, what we do see is the following, and these are my last few remarks. One is that all parties have treated the Palestinian constitutional system as plastic or malleable. Back in 2003, 2004, the international community pressed hard on Yasser Arafat to allow constitutional changes that would create the new post of a prime minister and shift powers from the president to the prime minister in an attempt to outflank Arafat, which made a lot of sense to Palestinians as well, I think, and was a good thing overall. But then once Arafat was dead and Hamas was in power, of course everything was different, and the international community started to push to move powers back to the president from the prime minister, and to allow, advocate, support, endorse very dubious interpretations of constitutional law in Palestine in order to justify the president taking over increasing powers. The president now issues decrees constantly determining all sorts of things within the Palestinian system. And as we know, since June, through Hamas's coup in Gaza, which it regards as a preemptive coup against what was being prepared against it, we now have two rival governments in Palestine, each claiming constitutional legitimacy. In other words, everyone has treated the Palestinian constitutional system as malleable, therefore it's up for grabs. Therefore, local or domestic actors, Palestinians, have understood that they can all push the envelope and they can all interpret their own mandate in a way that suits them. If major outsiders regard the Palestinian constitutional system as malleable and democracy and the democratic will of the people as something to be challenged if politically expedient, then why shouldn't local actors do the same? And this is exactly what's happening. I think it's a trend in the wider Middle East. It's happening in Lebanon, it's happening in Iraq and elsewhere. And unfortunately, US policy tends to push in this direction. When it's politically expedient, we undermine or limit and weaken constitutional systems, customs, formal and informal. In Palestine, we now have two governments. We're not going to get another single government, I think, in Palestine. Now, what this leaves us with, in my view, is a new type of status quo, one in which the key actors, and by this I mean the Palestinian Authority under President Abbas and Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, the Israeli government, and the Western donors, have converged, in effect, on maintaining the status quo through massive injection of aid. The international community now injects aid on a massive scale, more massive than ever before, at a level that the World Bank about 2 years ago, after the disengagement from Gaza, They then were looking at something like $800 million a year going in, and arguing that if the international community wanted to kickstart the economy, get growth, reduce unemployment, and allow the private sector to really start contributing in a major way to job creation and economic growth, within 3 years, what was needed was about $500 million more a year. We now have that much more money going in, but it's simply to prevent total chaos, total meltdown. It's just to keep people alive with food aid, with emergency job creation and handouts and so on. So we are all now structurally committed to a long-term aid situation in which the Palestinians have become chronically dependent on aid for basic survival, not even for growth. There's no talk about growth, regeneration, anything of that sort. We're not talking about rebuilding infrastructure or capacity. This is pure humanitarian assistance, relief. And it's a long-term prospect. But in effect, the international community, i.e. the United States, the EU primarily, have accepted this. We pay lots more money, you just keep off our backs politically. I don't think the international conference we're coming to will change that fundamental equation. Now, however, this is a degenerative status quo because the socioeconomic indicators on the Palestinian side are fundamentally problematic. They don't allow people to maintain their lives and livelihoods in a normal way and to build on that. They're wholly dependent now. And therefore, the socioeconomic trends, the fragmentation of the local economy, its compartmentalization, what the World Bank has called the compression of social economic space as people are limited to ever smaller zones of movement and trade and so on. The informalization of the economy, much of the labor employment now is in informal labor, in paid-in-kind labor, family labor, field labor. These are long-term consequences, will have long-term effects on the economy, the structure of the economy. So that's degenerative. Second, as I said, Hamas is stuck in a position where it can't provide solutions. It's going to inevitably, I think, have to start either increasing its internal control in Gaza, and we already see signs of that. It's taking on clans such as the Daghmash clan, the Hillis clan, Islamic Jihad, in order to assert its total control over what happens across the Gaza border, so as to be able to fine-tune its sort of escalation and regulation of the conflict with Israel for its own political purpose. So there's an internal repressive direction, but also a potential for escalation with Israel. And finally, and not least at all, is the fact that Israel constantly destabilizes the situation. It has basically taken over much of what the Palestinian Authority used to do, not only because someone had to, but also because there has been, according to Moshe Ya'alon, who's chief of staff in 2002, a policy of constructive deconstruction, to deconstruct the Palestinian Authority, to revert many of its roles and functions to the Israeli civil administration and military government, and then to create some new system that will eventually emerge from that, relying in the meantime on the international community, the UN system, UNRWA, to subsidize the occupation in effect. So Israel doesn't pay the financial burden, it just deals with the security aspect and sends squads into the city, hit people, assassinate, arrest, detain, as and when needed. In other words, a situation of perpetual insecurity and conflict, maintained in effect and exacerbated by Israeli action, whether justifiably or not, but nonetheless this is the impact, and of course behind which there is always the continuing settler colonization of parts of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, which is not something that is beyond the Israeli government. This is something that is backed directly in many ways, as we've seen chronicled and documented many times, both covertly and overtly by the Israeli government. Most recently, the new issue of the attempt to confiscate the so-called E1 corridor, which is the last remaining major area of free land between East Jerusalem and the West Bank, which the Israelis are now trying to take over and connect the Ma'ale Adumim bloc to West Jerusalem through. With these sorts of factors coming in, socioeconomic, the Hamas issue, and Israeli action and policy, I feel this is a status quo that is maintained by aid but is ultimately fundamentally degenerative. And where it goes, I can't predict much more, but it is not going in the direction of a reconstitution of a Palestinian body politic. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Khalil?
Thank you, Rob. Good morning. I'll talk about three elements of the Palestinian domestic environment. One is the public opinion, where things are, what the public thinks about the various issues of the peace process and domestic developments. The second is going to be about Hamas itself, what is happening within Hamas. And the third is going to be about what's happening within Fatah. And we'll not make conclusions about where all of this leading, and I'll leave it up to you to make those conclusions. But I'll start by describing 4 of the main features of the current environment in which all of this is taking place. And I'll do this very quickly because Yazid has already touched on all of this. As Yazid said, we do have 2 governments, and of course we do not have a state yet. And the West Bank and Gaza separation is now almost complete. What is interesting, of course, is that the 2 governments we have are controlled by 2 different factions. One in Gaza controlled by Hamas, one in the West Bank is controlled by Fatah. This affects everything else in the environment, and it affects everything else that I'll say about all the other 3 elements. The second main feature is that the economy is continues to suffer. In Gaza in particular, the economy is being destroyed, deliberately destroyed. It is being deliberately destroyed by policies that are pursued by Israel, essentially, but it's also part of the Fatah strategy of isolating Hamas. In the West Bank, things are not much better, by the way. There hasn't really been any. There's been a lot of talk about West Bank first strategy of the authority itself and the U.S. But in reality, if you live in the West Bank, you won't notice that there hasn't really been any major investments, economic investments in the West Bank during the last 4 months since Hamas's takeover of Gaza, and conditions in the West Bank economically continue to deteriorate. The third feature of this environment is the relative level of order in Gaza. Hamas has been able to assert order, not law and order, but order in Gaza. In the West Bank, there is some improvement in the level of law and order, but it's still, the situation in Gaza is definitely much better under Hamas with regard to order than it is in the West Bank. The fourth main feature is that the Israeli policies on the ground, particularly with regard to the West Bank, haven't really changed, whether it is a matter of the settlements or the closure regime, particularly the checkpoints and access. There hasn't really been any improvement. If anything, there has been some more complications, and the Israeli closure regime, I would say today, is much tighter than it was on the day Hamas took over Gaza. As you notice, I'm focusing essentially on the post-June events after Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. That is the environment in which the public opinion is being formed. Let me say 3 things about public opinion. Number 1 is going to be about the peace process. That is, what is the nature of compromise the public is willing to accept? I'll do this very quickly. And the second is going to be about the balance of power, how the public perceives the Fatah-Hamas confrontations. And the third one is going to be about expectations, what the public thinks about the events of the day with regard to the peace process, as well as domestic developments. The first one is about the peace process, as I said. And I would say that during the last 4 or 5 years, the public attitudes have not really changed. To a large extent, these attitudes have been shaped by what happened during the Intifada, and as importantly, what happened around the end of 2005 when the Israelis unilaterally pulled out from Gaza. Before that, Arafat died, Abu Mazen was elected. And that attitude regarding the peace process, therefore, is a matter of basically cost-benefit calculations. When the Palestinians view the peace process, they essentially look at it from 3 angles. One is what is available. And essentially, they conclude that a comprehensive settlement is what they prefer, since this is also what the Israelis wanted at Camp David. So theoretically, the Palestinians want a comprehensive settlement to all the issues, and there is a tremendous public support for that. But when the Palestinians look at the cost of a comprehensive settlement, then the percentage of support for that kind of settlement goes down considerably. So if you have 80%, 75% support for a comprehensive settlement, when one looks at the price of a comprehensive settlement, the level of support goes down considerably to about 45, 50%. Sometimes It's actually reached 55% at one point. And it could go back to 55% with strong and courageous leadership. The second choice is an interim settlement. Although there isn't as much support for an interim settlement at the theoretical level among Palestinians as there is for a comprehensive settlement, when one looks at the cost involved, what price Palestinians would be asked to pay for an interim settlement, we find that the level of support for interim settlement actually jumps considerably. So theoretically, a quarter of the Palestinians or 1/3 only would support an interim settlement. But if one looks at a concrete example of an interim settlement and what price the public is asked to pay, we actually get to almost 2/3 of the public supporting an interim settlement at the costs involved in an interim one. The third choice is a forced Israeli withdrawal. That is, resort to violence, forcing the Israeli to unilaterally pull out from occupied territories. This has been the preferred choice of the Palestinians throughout most of the Intifada. Throughout most of the Intifada, the public continued to believe that violence pays and that the violent confrontations with Israel have helped the Palestinians achieve national rights in ways that negotiations could not. Although the level of support for this choice, which reached almost 2/3, sometimes actually 3/4, has now gone down considerably to about 50%, a little less, a little more. The real impetus for this, in fact, in terms of cost benefit, came as a result of the Israeli unilateral disengagement from Gaza. If the public is forced to choose between the three, I would say the public would go for the third. As long as it believes that it works, they will continue to support the third choice. Now, what is the price involved? A lot of blood and treasure. So far, it seems the public is willing to accept that price. The second issue I wanted to talk about is how the public views the split and the confrontations between Fatah and Hamas. Since the victory of Hamas in January 2006, and up until Hamas took over Gaza, the balance of power essentially remained static. Despite all the pressure on Hamas, Hamas essentially remained, the popularity of Hamas remained essentially unchanged. We've seen slight decrease, gradual decrease in the level of support, but almost none of those who defected from Hamas went to Fatah or to other parties. They essentially remained on the sideline. And given what happened before the elections in January, I think it would be a big mistake to think that those who left Hamas, defected from Hamas, and stood at the sideline would somehow go to other parties when the moment of truth comes. Therefore, my assumption has been up until June that, in fact, the balance of power hasn't changed at all between January 2006 and June 2007. However, in June, things started to change, not because the public deserted Hamas. There has been a slight decrease in the level of support for Hamas as a result of the June takeover of Gaza. I emphasize slight. However, for the first time, we saw a major defection to Fatah. This is the first defection since the elections of January 2006. And if elections are held today, there is no doubt that even if all the undecided go to Hamas, Fatah would still do much better than Hamas in the elections. This is a significant transformation in the balance of power. What is behind it? What is behind it is a change in the public attitude regarding Hamas. And that, again, that did not translate in defections or significant defections from Hamas. I emphasize it only translated into many of those sitting on the sideline joining Fatah. What are these things that have happened? I would summarize what I will give you examples of in a minute as Hamas losing the high moral ground. Hamas has been able, before the elections, after the elections, and particularly because of the international sanctions, to claim the high moral grounds. Now it has lost it. I'll give you examples of how that has happened. The overwhelming majority, more than 3/4, reject Hamas's military takeover of Gaza. A larger percentage, significantly larger percentage of the public blames Hamas for the misery in which Gaza lives today. Not Fatah. In the past, the public was divided on the issue of whom to blame, Fatah or Hamas, for the misery of the Palestinians. Now they blame Hamas, not Fatah. Support for Fatah's call for early elections is greater than ever before. Almost again, between 2/3 and 3/4 of the public support Fatah's call for early election, despite the fact that Hamas is very strongly opposed to that. When asked to choose when asked to characterize the government of Hamas versus the government of Fatah in terms of legitimacy, more people believe that Salam Fayyad's government in the West Bank has more legitimacy, while Hamas's government does not. Hamas's call for a dialogue, unconditional dialogue, to restore unity, national unity, is rejected by a significant majority of the public, while Fatah's call, Abu Mazen's views with regard to how to restore unity, is supported by a large majority of the public. Abu Mazen has recently decreed, as Yazid said, he has been issuing a lot of decrees. One of those decrees is a very, very important decree that essentially changed the electoral system. Hamas has rejected the change, but again, a significant majority of the public supports that change. When asked how much trust people have in Hamas's media, 15% said they do. That is a significant decrease in the ability of Hamas to sell its own narrative to the public about a lot of issues. When asked to speculate about the future in Gaza under Hamas, the future of the West Bank under Fatah, in all issues we've asked about, 9 or 10 issues, from the economy to law and order to the peace process to payment of salaries, the public, all of it, both in West Bank and Gaza, came essentially to the belief that West Bank will be much better than conditions in the West Bank will be much better than conditions in Gaza. All of this, to my mind, translates as Hamas losing the high moral ground. Now, this is a significant change in public attitude, and I believe this is why a significant part of the public, I would say about 10% of the public, has moved since Hamas's takeover from sitting on the sideline to supporting Fatah. This is also being translated into public support for leaders. Hamas leaders are losing public support. Even the most moderate Hamas leaders, such as Haniya, is losing public support, while Fatah leaders, particularly Marwan Barghouthi and Abu Mazen, but much less Abu Mazen than Barghouthi, both, in fact, I would say, are gaining significant public support, much more support than they had a year ago or 6 months ago before Hamas's takeover. The last element, before I leave this element, I would have presented what I've just said in a much stronger terms yesterday or the day before. Today, I would say this could be just a passing moment. The minute the Israelis started to ration electricity and gas to Gaza is the minute when Hamas will again reclaim the high moral ground. And this Israeli policy the Israelis have done year after year since the start of the Intifada and haven't learned a thing out of it is what will undo everything I've just said. The third element that I want to say about public opinion is about expectations. And since I know that I'm running out of time and I just haven't finished even the first point, let me just very quickly say it is. There are two issues that I wanted to convey to you. One is expectations regarding what is going to happen with the peace process. And the public environment is very, very pessimistic. 2/3 or more do not believe a deal with Olmert is possible. 3/4 or more do not believe a Palestinian state is going to be established within the next 5 years. 3/4 of the Palestinians believe violence is going to stop and it will continue in the future. These are three very negative developments in the psychological environment of the public, and it basically translates into a very bleak outlook. This is also extremely significant because the bleaker the outlook, the much less willing the public is to entertain diplomatic moves. The second issue I want to talk about regarding expectations is expectations regarding the most important event that happened in domestic politics, and that is the split between West Bank and Gaza. A significant part, at least half of the public, believes this is not a temporary split, that it will, that the split is here to stay. I won't say that that all of the half of the population actually thinks this is permanent, but it's as close to permanent as you can get. So there is therefore also a highly pessimistic view about the unity of the Palestinian people. Let me now go quickly to my second point, and it's about Hamas and what's happening within Hamas. And here, what I want to say essentially are two things. One, what is happening within Hamas, and secondly, how is that impacting on the political environment and public psychology. The most important development since June, which in fact was the June event was only a symptom of that, is the growth of the hardliners within Hamas. And there are three lobbies within Hamas. This has always been the case. There is the lobby of the social agenda. These are people who want to Islamize society as quickly as possible, take advantage of Hamas's electoral victory. They have been pushing for this for long. Now they have a much better chance than before, than at any time since they have won the elections, and they want that happen, and they want it to happen as quickly as possible. Secondly, there are the hardliners in the military wing, or not just the military wing, but the hardliners who believe that violence has been successful and Hamas should continue with the violence as forcefully as possible. And the third lobby is the one that basically says Fatah has sold out and we should try to eliminate it as much as possible. That is, these are people who do not want any democratic political outcomes. Instead, they want to consolidate Fatah's control in the Gaza Strip and certainly in the West Bank if they could, regardless of what is the nature of the political system that they end up creating. These are three lobbies. These three lobbies were resisted very, very strongly and effectively by the more moderate leadership, Ismail Haniyeh, some of his advisors, and in fact, I would say all the outside leadership. Although Khalid Mash'al may have hesitated one way or the other at one time or another, today there is no doubt that both Mash'al and his deputy both are very strongly opposed to these three lobbies, yet they are unable, I believe, to effectively do anything about it. The reason they are not able to do anything about it is because they are not able to present an alternative. Remember, the moderates were successful in the past because they presented an alternative. The alternative was to go to elections, to win the elections, to influence the system from within the formal institutions. They were able to do it until the hardliners and the moderates believed that they were hitting a concrete wall and that there was no further progress. Now, what are the implications of all of this? The implications that Fatah has used all of these changes in order to depict Hamas as one that doesn't care about national unity, is willing to use force and violence to kill other Palestinians, that it has social agenda that is totally unacceptable to the overwhelming majority that was creating a Taliban kind of government, and that its relationship with Israel is a nice one. The hardliners are hardliners domestically, but that in their relationship with Israel, if you look at the Palestinian press every day, you'll find, I bet, at least 5 to 10 stories that will speak to any one of these three elements that I've just outlined. So I'll go very quickly in the last minute to the issue of Fatah and the changes within Fatah. Fatah's game plan since Hamas took over has been isolate Hamas in Gaza, improve living conditions in the West Bank. This has been one way they believe they will restore their credibility and win public support. Secondly, deliver a peace agreement with Israel or progress in talks with Israel that will show the public that diplomacy works, that violence is not necessarily the answer, that Fatah's ways, Abu Mazen's ways with regard to contacts with Israel is the best way to go. And the third one has been to try and improve living conditions in the Gaza Strip, restore the conditions in the Gaza Strip to the pre-Intifada era. so far, and of course there has been a fourth way that Fatah has consistently tried to improve things. I wouldn't consider it as part of their game plan today, but I believe Fatah would include it as part of the game plan, and that is to reform Fatah. I would say that there has been little, if any, reforms within Fatah. There is a lot of talk about reform, but really hasn't been much. Conditions in the West Bank haven't really improved a bit at all. The Israelis are just making sure that it doesn't. And thirdly, the question of what to do about the peace process is, of course, hanging. And Fatah is putting a lot of capital on the success of the November meeting. This is my conclusion, if the November meeting doesn't succeed, so I'm not making any conclusions about it, whether it will or not, but if it doesn't succeed, then this whole Fatah game plan, in my view, will simply crumble. And Abu Mazen will have no choice but either to go back to Hamas, accept its conditions, or consolidate the separation in the West Bank, between Gaza and the West Bank. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mustafa.
Thank you. Well, I guess to understand the Palestinian situation, one has to really put things in context. And I think one has to remember that the most recent developments in the occupied territories, including the success of Hamas in elections and then the division that took place, were results of two specific factors. One is that there was a failure of the peace process. And when I say a failure of the peace process, I don't mean Camp David meeting, which is always exaggerated as the failure. Actually, the failure was the failure of Oslo process, the failure of the whole approach of interim agreements, the failure of the whole approach that thought that if you create a good interim agreement, you can create confidence between both sides and then help them solve the problem. What happened was the creation of distrust, mistrust, and more problems. So the second factor that led to this situation was the failure of Fatah and the Palestinian Authority to reform, to conduct an agenda of reform, and even to build institutions that could be described as state institutions. And the two particular elements that led, in my opinion, to the strengthening of Hamas, especially during the election time, was first of all the consolidation of nepotism and clientelism as a way of governance. And I would add here to what Khalil described, that the disappointment with Hamas is more actually on this issue, because when Hamas came into power with the agenda of reform and change, when they got to power, they practiced the same nepotism and clientelism that Fatah did. And that is one of the main causes why they could lose public opinion. But that particular element was a major factor why Hamas won the elections in the beginning. And then the whole policy was wrong. I mean, a policy where the government budget was devoting 9% to health, 0.9% to agriculture, and more than 27% of the budget of the Palestinian Authority was devoted to the so-called security. This whole system was not working. Well, Palestinians, in my opinion, responded to that failure, both of the peace process and internally, by democratic reform, democratic change, by democratic process. And that democratic process produced a response to that failure. It is true that there was an overdose of that, and the overdose was in the fact that Hamas won a majority. But the fact that Hamas won a majority, by the way, was not really a reflection of the proportional votes they got. It was the fact that Hamas got a majority in the Legislative Council was a result of the fact that Fatah refused a proportional system before elections took place. And as a result of that, we had Hamas winning. But at the same time, we had a situation where completely an embargo was imposed on the Palestinian territories. Now, while one could understand and maybe not accept, but one could understand why an embargo would be put on a Hamas government because of its policies, one cannot really accept, I personally don't understand why an embargo was put on the National Unity Government, which represented actually a recognition from Hamas side that they cannot run or govern alone. a national unity government that represented 96% of the Palestinian electorate. And I think you could not be more democratic than that. And a national unity government that presented a rather flexible program that supports two-state solution, suspension of violence with one condition, that violence will be stopped from both sides and not only from one side, and then a national unity government that supported practically the Arab initiative and declared that it is ready to honor international law, international humanitarian law, and existing agreements. With all of this was ignored because Israel decided that this is not what should happen. And in my opinion, the biggest failure of the international community was not to recognize the opportunity that was there when we had a national unity government. That opportunity provided a possibility of strengthening the moderate part of Hamas. It provided a possibility of maybe containing Hamas into the peace process and shifting it away maybe from countries like Iran. Third, it provided a real opportunity for conducting a true reform that would have eliminated gradually, hopefully, the system of nepotism and, most important, the factionalism of the security apparatus. And finally, this would have presented, in my opinion, an opportunity to initiate a true peace process. Probably, in my opinion, in my analysis, a national unity government, if it had survived, would have led to early elections, maybe sometime in the end of 2008 or the beginning of 2009. And then it would have been probably possible to have proportional system, and then neither Hamas nor Fatah could have gained absolute majority. Unfortunately, the division took place, but that division must be perceived clearly as a result of very clear pressure that was exercised externally on the Palestinian side. The Israeli embargo first, the American embargo second, and then the international embargo, and finally the Arabs joining the club. That led to the collapse of that opportunity, but it also led to a very dangerous element, which is the paralysis of the democratic institution, and what Yazid described very well as a paralysis of the whole system of the Palestinian Authority. Mind you, this is not the first time democracy is slaughtered in Palestine. The first time it happened in 1976, when we had, for the first time, municipality elections that were allowed by Israel. And the thought at that time was that these elections would produce a leadership that would accept to be an alternative to the PLO at the time. But when the results of elections came, most of those who won were supporters of the PLO, and within a year or two, all municipalities were dismissed by Israel. Many of the mayors were deported, although they were democratically elected, and some of them even were subjected to bombardment, like Bassam Shaka. So this is not the first time that democracy is killed. On the other hand, the absence of democratic structures now is leading to a situation where we have two governments that both of them are claiming legitimacy, and if we look carefully at the basic law, it is clear that none of them really has legitimacy, and that is the most dangerous element. On the other hand, we witness on the ground a return to the same style of negotiations. There isn't even any level of reconsideration of how the previous Palestinian negotiating team functioned before, and thus it's the same team that is negotiating again. That by itself, by the way, is enough to create big doubts among the Palestinian public about how these negotiations will happen. Internally, we're back to the same system or talk about creating Palestinian internal institutions, and big emphasis on building a security apparatus. Now, I told you about the budget that was the budget of the Palestinian government that led to a big failure. It is interesting to look at the existing budget of Salam Fayyad government. This budget has reduced health expenditure from 9% to 8%, reduced agriculture from 0.9% to 0.7%, reduced expenditure on culture to 0.3%, and increased the budget for security from 27% to 38%. Even the Soviet Union could not tolerate that. So what is really happening, Khalil described the situation inside Fatah. I would say because of the most recent international developments, I see a regression and deterioration of the reformer or the reformist camp inside Fatah. What we see is really the reconsolidation of the power and the control of the old camp with international support this time. What we see inside Hamas, I agree, is a strengthening of the more extreme side of Hamas at the expense of the pragmatic and moderate side. And please note that the pragmatic side, I would describe Hamas as having three trends, although it's a unified body with a unified decision-making system. One trend is moderate, one trend is pragmatic, and one trend is extreme. I think the extreme trend, especially in Gaza, has been strengthened at the expense of the two other trends. And thirdly, as we said, we have witnessed a destruction of the democracy and the possibility of creation, not only a split between West Bank and Gaza that would last, but practically the creation of two autocracies. I don't want to devote a lot of talk about the Israeli policies, but let me say that I agree that there are four very serious processes that continue to happen on the ground. None of that has changed. The first process is the expansion of settlements. Although suspension of settlement activities is point number one in the roadmap, we do not see any serious pressure to stop the settlement expansion. Since Oslo up till now, the settlements have increased in size and population by 100% at least. The wall is being built, and it's not just a wall, it's a structure that is 90% of the cases separating Palestinians from Palestinians, not Palestinians from Israelis. It's a wall that is going to be 3 times the length of Berlin Wall, and it is determining the borders from one side. Third, what we see on the ground, and I know some people don't like this word, but I have to say it, is nothing but the creation of an apartheid system on the ground. The water consumption for Palestinians in the West Bank is 50 cubic meters per capita per year. It is 2,400 for Israeli settlers. The GDP in Israel was 6 times more than the Palestinian GDP in 1993. Now it's 30 times more. At the same time, we are obliged to buy products at Israeli market price. And we are the only place probably in the world where one government has to give the taxes it collects from people to another government, which is Israel in this case. And Israel is the one that decides whether our government can receive the taxes back or not. This is, and those who negotiated such an agreement are back to negotiations. Then this is a place where you have segregation not only of people, but it's probably the first time in history of human beings where you have segregation of roads and streets. And in addition to that, there is a fourth process, which is the separation, of course, of Gaza from the West Bank, the declaration of Gaza as a hostile territory, with all what that means in terms of a severe humanitarian crisis to the level that people who need surgical operations recently do not find a theater to have that operations in. Why is that happening? Why this whole dilemma? I think the main cause is that Israel up till now has not decided that Palestinians should have an independent Palestinian state. I don't speak about the name of a state, because you could call anything any name. I mean, during the South African apartheid system, there were Bantustans, and in some of the Bantustans you had kings and kingdoms, but they remained Bantustans. And in our situation, I don't think Israel has decided that Palestinians can have a state with sovereignty, with borders, with control of export, import, and their own destiny. The second reason is that there has been an Israeli policy of insisting on the separation of Gaza from the West Bank to the level, I think, of making this irreversible. If that is the case, then we are talking about the elimination of the two-states option rather than consolidation of a two-states option. And third, there is a persistent policy on the side of all Israeli people in the Israeli government, which is not to negotiate now final status issues, to delay them one more time. And at the same time, there is pressure to transform the Palestinian Authority into a security sub-agent. Now, I want to touch here, before I finish, on the issue of security. I think there is a very serious, profound, wrong approach to the question of security in the case of Palestine. To think that the Palestinians who are under occupation can or should provide security to their occupiers is something that is not only wrong, but objectively unachievable. It is unachievable given the fact that the Palestinian Authority under occupation is not in control of roads, it's not in control even of the ability of transforming or shifting a small unit of policemen from one city to another. It is a situation where the authority itself is not in control of its borders. So to expect, the whole concept of expecting an authority which is under occupation to provide protection and security to its occupiers, who represent a rather super military force, is probably completely unobjective and incorrect. And it creates a catch-22 situation, where the Palestinians are expected to do something, they can't do it, and because they can't do it, they are punished. And it goes on. In my opinion, this constant pressure on the Palestinian Authority to create such a security system, devoting 38% of the budget to security, with everything that was described by me and my colleagues, would probably lead to a gradual weathering of the Palestinian Authority. What we can see is gradual marginalization of the Palestinian Authority to the level of it becoming irrelevant, whether we are talking about West Bank or even Gaza. In other words, the whole strategy of change of regime could lead to a situation of no regime at all. And would Palestinians, now I want to answer the question of whether Palestinians could go back to negotiating together unity again, given my analysis of why a unified government is a better solution or a better approach to even the peace process and to the issue of democracy. I think all of that depends on what happens in autumn in this conference. But this autumn conference, Annapolis conference, will not succeed, in my opinion, unless 4 conditions are there. First, that there should be complete freeze of settlement activities, suspension of building the wall, cancellation of the decision of considering Gaza as a hostile territory, and Israel's accepting to negotiate final status with a clear timetable. Would that happen? I don't think so. If this does not happen, maybe the horizon will be open again, where Palestinian leadership and especially Fatah people will realize that they have to find one way or another to regain Palestinian unity and sustain some kind of joint entity. The big issue here, and before I touch on that, is that I want to remind you that please don't analyze the Palestinian situation as if it only is a place where you have only Fatah and Hamas. Please remember there is a very serious democratic non-Hamas and non-Fatah trend that is, by the way, doing very well in the polls. I don't know why Khalil doesn't talk about that. But I guess this whole notion of describing the situation in Palestine as if it's only paralyzed between Hamas and Fatah is not correct. And I would take the polls results also with a big grain of salt, because we know very well how the polls, what were the polls results back before the elections. And we know very well that many Hamas people decline to respond when they are asked to comment or to give answers to questions. So these factors have to be considered in analyzing any of the polls. The big fact here is the following, and that is my conclusion. With unified Palestinian camp, with democracy in place, Israel will encounter a tougher negotiations. With Palestinian unified camp and with democracy in place, Israel will have to make more concessions. But if that happens, if we have negotiations with all Palestinians in it, Israel will get an agreement that will last. If Israel opts to continue the existing course, and of course when I speak about Israel, I speak also about the United States policy, which seems to be supportive of the Israeli policy. If they continue the existing course, Israel might get easy negotiators, easy negotiations, maybe even a solution, although I doubt it, but that solution will not last and will not be implemented, because there won't be a force that can implement it. And that's what the Israelis keep saying, by the way. They keep saying that we cannot negotiate final status because the Palestinian Authority is weak and it is not in control. At the same time, they don't want to have Palestinian national unity, which leads me to the understanding then there is no need, they are not wanting negotiations at all. That is the big question that has to be raised. I personally believe in democracy. I believe in nonviolence, in solving all our problems. And I think the whole international community must provide the necessary conditions for these two very important elements to succeed. And I think, for me, one indicator will always be a true indicator of whether Israel wants really to achieve a peaceful solution or not. In my opinion, if Israel supports democracy, then it really wants peace. If it doesn't, I have big doubts. Why? For the very simple factor and for the very simple lesson that we've learned from history, that only agreements that are concluded between two democracies can last. If an agreement is imposed from one side on the other, it won't last. Thank you.
We've just heard three hard-hitting, some might argue brutally honest presentations about the Palestinians and their politics. One admittedly editorial comment, and then to the questions. Sadly, some would argue tragically, we've seen under both Democratic and American and Republican administrations one elemental fact, that bad policy flows from bad analysis. And bad analysis flows from seeing the world not the way it is, but the way, for any number of reasons, we want it to be. And as we enter this critical year, prospective peacemaking, and even more important in the years ahead, I think it's absolutely essential that we come back to this fundamental fact that analyses by diplomats, intelligence analysts, and politicians have to be presented in ways that are reasonably uncoated with either honey on one hand, too much honey on one hand, or too much vinegar on the other. So let's go to the questions, and I will be much firmer than I was here in terms of enforcing time deadlines. We want questions. It's a complicated, emotional issue, but we want questions so that we can allow our presenters to answer them. We have two roving mics and a number of written questions from the overflow room.
Thank you very much for a
I'm sorry, could you identify yourself?
My name is Paul Sham from the Middle East Institute. I also would like to welcome Holly back, and I think all of us greet her with great relief seeing her. The question is, if, and this is a very big if, but if there is an American president with a policy of going back to more or less what Clinton tried to do in 2009, do you think, and this is to all of you, do you think that this can change the dynamics of what you have described to the extent of creating a Palestinian polity that would be able to enforce an agreement with Israel? And also, this is assuming that Israel would be encouraged to go back to something like the Clinton parameters.
Anyone?
I'll go ahead. My own view bottom line is that no one can put it back together again. So there are policy interventions that should have been engaged in back in the 1990s. There were bad policies pursued by all the key parties, and I mean the Palestinian Authority under Yasser Arafat, successive Israeli governments, right up to and including the Barak government, very definitely, and the American administration. And, I mean, this is my view of history, is that there are convergences. What was possible in 1993 or 94 was made possible by convergence, a coincidence of international developments, the end of the Cold War, the Gulf War, shifts in Arab opinion, shifts in domestic Palestinian balances, and in Israel, with the influx of Soviet Jews, all sorts of different things that made it possible at that moment for someone like Yitzhak Rabin to come to power, Arafat to have the incentive to sign a deal, etc. Those sorts of that sort of convergence doesn't exist today and hasn't for a while yet. And with the war on terror, all sorts of other things happening in the world, the U.S. involvement in Iraq, there are all sorts of reasons why, good and bad, why the different parties can't get together again in the right way. You may have majorities among Israelis and Palestinians who accept a two-state solution, understand there's a certain sacrifice to be made and would accept that. But that doesn't translate into political leaders taking those political decisions. So for all sorts of reasons, I don't think it's going to come about. And there's a certain path dependency, if you like. On the one hand, the Palestinian Authority, Arafat, Fatah, made tremendous strategic mistakes and bear, I think, criminal responsibility, in particular for the militarization of the Intifada in the year 2000. The government of Israel did not for one day stop its settlement activity in the occupied territories from day one of Oslo onwards. And that, I think, is something for which it bears criminal responsibility in a historical sense as well. And furthermore, the international community took a position from October 1993, which was basically, we will inject aid and finance into this. We will not tackle the political issues head on. And what that has left us with is basically that the political goalposts, the benchmarks, the standards were never imposed clearly and unequivocally. And in the past few years, to the extent that penalties have been imposed, they have been imposed almost entirely against the Palestinian side, justifiably or not. I mean, the Palestinians have suffered reoccupation, the isolation of Yasser Arafat in his little compound, de-recognition in effect, because people would no longer go and see him, and I mean, he wanted Bush and Sharon to talk to him, and they didn't. Palestinian statehood, which had been expressed by the European Union 98-99 as an unequivocal, clear-cut issue and aim and objective, and by the Bush administration in 2002 in its support for the UN resolution in March on two-state solution, became provisional, i.e. became contingent and conditional. So the Palestinians have been made to pay a price. Then the sanctions, of course, which went way beyond we won't talk to Hamas, we don't give aid to Hamas or Hamas affiliates, which is understandable, to a tertiary boycott, which is an active imposition of an embargo to prevent all third parties as well from interacting with that particular entity. That's going basically to war with an entity when you impose a tertiary boycott. So all the sanctions have come one direction. Israel has not suffered one penalty for any of its settlement activities or for its failure to implement, with the exception of 6 illegal outposts that were removed at the time of Gaza from the northern West Bank. Otherwise, even the formal pledges of various governments, including the Sharon government, to remove so-called illegal outposts have not been fulfilled, one iota, with that one single exception. And in the meantime, of course, new ones have been built and more covert assistance has been provided. So basically, the international community has not affected the incentive structure, the cost-benefit calculations of the key parties in ways that might bring about a shift, a fundamental shift in their political behavior. And nor has it, in fact, shifted its own political behavior.
Yes. George.
My name is George Hishmi. I'm just wondering, why do you expect Israel to negotiate a final settlement with half the Palestinians? Am I seeing things differently than most people, or what's going on here?
Okay. May I respond to that?
Sure.
Well, the question is whether Israel wants to negotiate at all, not whether it wants to negotiate. Actually, if it wanted to negotiate with all the Palestinians, there was a chance, and that was to negotiate with the National Unity Government. And by the way, let me tell you that this was not like an impossibility. I personally, as you know, as some of you know maybe, I personally mediated the agreement of national unity between Fatah and Hamas. And I also personally participated in negotiations between Abbas and Olmert in the presence of Ismail Haniyeh, by the way, in the same room, when they were talking on the phone and concluded the first ceasefire agreement regarding Gaza, which lasted for 2 months, where Palestinians did not shoot any missile, conducted no violence whatsoever, in expectation that Israel would do the same. And it was Israel that violated that agreement. What does that mean? It means that if Israel really wanted negotiations with all Palestinians, they had the chance, and it was the national unity government. Now they say they don't want national unity government, they don't want unified Palestinians, they want to negotiate only with Mr. Abbas, and at the same time they criticize him for being too weak because he is not representing all Palestinians. What does that mean? It means they don't want to negotiate. Personally, I need to be convinced that Israel wants to negotiate. I need to be convinced that Israel wants to tackle the main issues, which are the final status issues. And if we postpone these issues for 14 years, between 1993 and 2007, why do we have to postpone them for 20 to 30 years to come, as Mr. Olmert is saying? Is that because they need more time to consolidate a unilateral Israeli-imposed borders and result on the ground, regardless of what Palestinians think? That is, in my opinion, a very, very, very short-sighted policy. Israel is, in my opinion, missing a huge historical opportunity. They always blamed us for missing opportunities. But here is not only a readiness on the Palestinian side to accept two-state solution, you have all the Arab countries behind the Arab Initiative, which means end occupation, discuss the issue of refugees, and get full recognition and full normalization. And this opportunity is being missed again.
Yes. As I said, it's in the front row.
Tony Walker of the Financial Review of Australia. I wonder if the speakers could reflect on the likelihood of Annapolis actually taking place. If it does take place, what might happen there, and what might be the consequences of failure?
Mustafa, you alone among the speakers have offered your view of what it would take for Annapolis to succeed. The 4 points that you raised.
Yes.
You could elaborate on that, but Khalil and Yazid, it would really be good to hear your views.
With pleasure. Okay. Well, you see, there has been already. The issue is as follows: the United States is interfering by saying they want, they're basically saying two things. First of all, that the United States supports the vision, the Bush vision of having two states, a Palestinian state. Yet, I think even that vision has changed some of the major serious parameters, like international law, and the fact that 67 borders are the borders that should exist according to international law, and accepted a new principle, which is that the outcome would be somewhere between that international law and the existing reality on the ground. And that is a major change in my opinion. On the other hand, the United States is saying, we want to convene this meeting, and by the way, they didn't call it a conference, they called it a meeting. And this meeting will be something which will give push and support to both sides, the Palestinians and Israelis, who have to negotiate an agreement by themselves. It's very different from the notion of international peace conference, which took place in Madrid, by two things. First of all, international peace conference was based on international participation and not just one side running the show. And second, it referred to international law and international UN resolutions as the basis for a solution. This meeting is quite different. Second major difference is that that conference structured the peace process while in this case it will be just a meeting to encourage a peace process which should be conducted only between two sides, which are Palestinians and Israelis. And I guess everybody realizes that the other parts of the Middle East crisis or issue or conflict, like Syrian-Israeli issue or Lebanese-Israeli issue, are put aside. So with these factors in place, and with the Palestinians and Israelis who have met already 7 times, Olmert has met with President Abbas 7 times, they haven't moved an inch on the main issue. And the main issue is, are we going to negotiate final status or not? And if we negotiate final status issues, is there a timetable to finish these negotiations or not? Israel still insists to concentrate most of the talks on one specific issue, which is the internal Palestinian situation and what they call building Palestinian institutions, and big emphasis on the issue of security and what kind of economic regime will exist, which means, in my opinion, that Israel wants to consolidate most of the talks around the issue of how to make the Palestinian Authority subjective to the Israeli overall needs. Even Mr. Blair, and I really was very surprised about the fact that he accepted such job description. He was given a job description that limits his intervention just to the issue of Palestinian institution building, and he's accepting that. This is not a role of a mediator in a very serious and long conflict. That's why I come back to my 4 points. If this meeting is to become something serious, there has to be 4 conditions. The first one is the complete cease of settlement activities. This must happen before the conference takes place, or the conference should start with that, because unless that happens, all Palestinians have a big question about why are we negotiating when the Israeli side continues to change facts on the ground. Second, the elimination or change of the decision about considering Gaza a hostile territory. Why? This has 2 important values. First of all, with Israelis and Palestinians negotiating and the Israeli army bombarding Gaza and killing Palestinians there, the popularity of Mr. Abbas and his people is going down. And on the other hand, this insistence on separation of Gaza from West Bank means that there will not be one political entity in the long run. And if that is the case, then what kind of a state we are talking about? But the third and very important condition is also to stop building the wall. Why? Because the wall, if you look at, I'm sorry I don't have the map with me, but I encourage you very much to look at the map of the wall. When you look at it, you will discover that it is actually separating already more than 42% of the land of the West Bank from the rest of it. It is isolating Jerusalem completely. It is cutting the West Bank into at least 4 pieces. And the West Bank is anyhow a very small territory. So, in my opinion, building the wall is by itself a sentence of death of the idea of an independent sovereign Palestinian state. So without these 3 conditions and finally a timetable of final status negotiations, I really doubt that the meeting will be anything more than probably something like the Sharm el-Sheikh meeting, which took place once, to show that the international solidarity community is supporting a process between Palestinians and Israelis. Now let me be, you said that we were brutally honest. Let me be also honest here and say, given the existing imbalance of forces between the Palestinian negotiating government now, I mean Mr. Abbas and the government in West Bank and Israel, I think expecting them to reach a balanced agreement is like expecting putting a sheep and a fierce tiger in one room and expect them to reach an agreement. It's impossible. Without serious international involvement, even from the perspective of Israeli internal policies. You see, Olmert is already under terrible pressure from inside not to make any agreement about anything. So to reach an agreement, he needs pressure to encounter the internal pressure he is facing in Israel. And if that does not exist, how can you objectively expect an outcome? I hope I'm wrong, but that's how it looks.
I'll say something about the possible consequences of failure. I've already said that in my introductory remarks. I think 2 things could happen if it fails. One, I think Hamas will be able to claim again, that its way, not Abu Mazen's way, is the right way to go, and I think it will find a lot of public support for that view. The second, and therefore it will become a tougher negotiator to Abu Mazen. It will wait. It won't ask Abu Mazen to come negotiate. Now it will wait for his phone call. As far as Abu Mazen is concerned, I think he would have two options. I tend to believe he will take the first one, which is to call Hamas and say, okay, I'm willing to sit down. But in this case, of course, he will have to live with Hamas's conditions, and he isn't going to be able to force Hamas to accept his conditions for the dialogue. And the alternative, which I think is less likely to take, but I think it's realistic because there are very strong pressures on him to do that within Fatah. I don't think this is his own personal preference, is to consolidate control over the West Bank, and by doing so he would of course be essentially consolidating the separation between West Bank and Gaza. So that is also one possibility. In the long run, this second option, however, I don't think is viable. I don't think it's viable because I doubt very much that he will succeed, as given the continued Israeli policies in the West Bank and given what I believe the Israelis will do in the West Bank after a failure, expecting a third intifada to emerge, which will mean that they will be taking even tougher steps, military and otherwise, in the West Bank. Then I expect that a decision to consolidate control in the West Bank is likely to fail. And I would expect in this case that the separation would continue, but that conditions in the West Bank would be such that the ability of government to continue to exist in the manner that we see today is questionable, and therefore I would expect the collapse. I don't know whether Hamas will actually inherit the situation in the West Bank eventually, but I think a collapse of the government is feasible. The Israelis would have either to reassume full control or just unilaterally withdraw, leaving the situation in the West Bank in a much worse conditions than it is today.
You want me to? All right. To be honest, I've hardly thought about the Annapolis conference at all. I mean, when President Bush first announced this initiative, there was a lot of stirring rhetoric in most, 95% of the text. And then at the end, you get to the bottom line, which is, all right, so in order to get to this wonderful vision, let's start with Palestinian reform. This is, in Arabic, what is it? We say we have an expression that says the mountain heaved and labored and finally produced a mouse. All this big talk and effort, and what do we get? A little mouse at the end. You can't be serious. So, evidently, there's no game plan. And now, Condi Rice goes around the region, and you'll get like a congressional bill here in the U.S. Various special interests will be tacked on. So we want to bring the Saudis on board because we want the Saudis on board against Iran and this and that. And finally, we'll end up with a mishmash that doesn't really serve the purpose. I think what's more interesting is going to be the fact that this conference, according to its present timetable, I think, is sandwiched in between two donor conferences relating to Palestine. And that's more interesting for me, i.e. we'll find out what the long-term prospect, i.e. for the next month or next year or so, is from a donor perspective. What sort of aid levels are they going to commit, to what, through what channels, what are their expectations? I think that's going to be a lot more interesting to tell us what the political perspective and sort of predictions are by the key players in this and what they're going to try and persuade the Israelis and the Abbas government to do. That's what to look at, I think, not really the Annapolis thing.
May I add one element, please? Please understand also that the whole legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority is also threatened. Mr. Abbas' election period ends in January 2009. He is returning, and the whole structure of the Palestinian Authority now in West Bank is trying to build their legitimacy on the PLO representation. But even that is being attacked already by other groups. The whole issue of the fact that the PLO did not have a national council since 1996 and did not have elections since then is also put on the table. So that's why I tend to think that with further failure, you could probably see the disappearance, gradual disappearance of the authority.
Barbara Slavin in the back.
Hi, Barbara Slavin from the U.S. Institute of Peace. I wanted to ask all of you about the influence of Iran on Hamas, how you see it increasing, how tactical or strategic you think this is on the part of Hamas. Is it just the money? Is there something more involved in terms of ideology? And if Humpty Dumpty really is broken and you can't put him back together again, who gets the pieces? Thanks.
Khalil.
There is no doubt that Hamas's election has put Hamas's electoral victory has put Hamas in a central stage as far as the Iranian strategy in the region is. And Iran, I think, is willing to spend a great deal of capital in order to strengthen Hamas and keep it afloat. It is doing that essentially mostly with regard to money. I do not believe there is a great deal of ideological affinity between the two. And I think Hamas is fully aware of the difficulties of fully associating itself with Iran, in part because of what's happening in Iraq. The overwhelming majority of the Palestinians sympathize with the Sunni Iraq, is not the Shia Iraqis, and they believe that Iran is in fact supporting the Shiites in Iraq. If and when a conflict, some believe it is inevitable, but if and when a conflict between Sunnites and Shiites in Iraq is to erupt as a civil war, then any association with Iran will become, in the Palestinian context, highly undesirable. And I think Hamas fully realizes this and will not try to use its relationship with Iran in its own domestic calculations with the Palestinian Authority. Now, the most effective means, as I said, of supporting Hamas has been the money, essentially because of the international sanctions. Hamas had no alternative but to seek support from wherever it can get it, and of course Iran has been willing to give. Whether that is in fact at the moment contributing to Hamas's control over the Gaza Strip, for example, I think is questionable. I don't think Hamas is able today to bring in money as much as it was able to do in the past. I think it has a much limited ability to bring in money into Gaza than the case was at any time before. Once the closure over Gaza has been tightened, Hamas was left essentially with the tunnels to bring in the money. The banks are no longer useful. Businesses, since businesses in Gaza are collapsing, businesses which were a main source of bringing Iranian money in has also been collapsing. So the utility at the moment seems to be limited. There is an added issue here, and that is the contacts between Iran and Hamas, essentially through the outside leadership, Khalid Mashal, Musab Marzouk, and the other leaders who live in Syria are the contact point with the Iranians. And at the moment, I don't believe the top leadership of Hamas is satisfied with the way things are going in Gaza. And with the hardliners becoming stronger within Gaza, and therefore I'm not sure that the Iranian factor has become worse since the takeover. I think in the early period, the first year after Hamas's electoral victory, Iran became critical for Hamas's continued control. But I doubt very much that this is the case today.
Can I just?
Yeah.
I just want to add one thing I should have mentioned, I suppose, in my presentation, that with failed state conditions, socioeconomic crisis, and loss of the legitimacy of governing institutions, and to the extent that Hamas itself is stuck between, were it, for instance, to move towards a national unity government as well, which would mean leading to negotiations with Israel, what we've already seen some sign of in Gaza is the emergence of jihadist-type groups, and in some cases groups such as the Popular Resistance Committees, the so-called Army of Islam that emerged from that, people who become radicalized, maybe opportunistically, but in conditions where there's institutional meltdown as well as socioeconomic meltdown, I think that becomes a very serious risk. And at the moment, Hamas, in Gaza at least, is effectively the one barrier against that sort of radicalization. The problem is, of course, that Hamas is in a very delicate position, because if it were to operate in a reasonably pragmatic manner, then no doubt there would be more extreme elements within it, more militant elements within its ranks, which would be tempted to break off overtly or implicitly and work with more jihadist organizations. I don't think that's inevitable. Khalil would be able to say more about this, but I just think that the potential for jihadism, i.e., sort of Al-Qaeda type rhetoric and behavior, is there, and we've seen a lot of signs of this in Gaza over the past year: attacks on internet cafes, mixed sex schools, festivities, whatever. The occasional attack on there's the director of a Christian bookshop, Palestinian, who's murdered. These are worrying trends, I think, and I'm not so worried about sort of a major Qaeda in Palestine organization emerging on the scale that we've seen in Iraq. I don't think that in itself is the risk. It just is indicative of the fundamental breakdown of social, political values, mores, structures, customs, traditions, etc. in Palestinian society, and how you put that back together again, how you heal that, I don't know.
Yes.
Dr. Barghouti, you mentioned that the PLO National Council hadn't met until 1996. It seems like most of the conversation today has talked about negotiations in the context of the Palestinian Authority, but we all know that it's the Palestinian Liberation Organization that signs on the dotted line at the end. They're apparently the ones who provide the negotiating team. Could you speak more, and if anybody has any other ideas from the panel, could you speak more about the PLO politics that are happening right now, and also the kind of proto-national unity initiatives that are happening in the diaspora, such as the Syrian factions meeting recently?
Shall I respond? Okay. Well, you see, much of what was described as criticism of the Palestinian Authority definitely applies to the PLO, because one of the major problems that the PLO has is that it has transformed into a bureaucracy that is, with years, become rigid and stiff and incapable of developing. And the fact that the whole idea of internal elections have been avoided all these years, including avoiding the convening of the Palestinian National Council, is by itself very indicative. In my opinion, the major, although we all keep saying the PLO is the representative of the Palestinian people, nobody is trying to undermine that, because we don't need yet another aspect of a division. But the biggest problem in the case of the PLO is that it has not developed enough to be able to incorporate the new groups that appeared on the scene in Palestine. And that does not only relate to Hamas, because of course you could have the excuse of saying that Hamas does not agree with the original program of the PLO, and because of that, PLO could not incorporate Hamas in. But that argument barely stands when it comes to a group like the Palestinian National Initiative, which proved to be at least stronger than many other little factions in the PLO who could not even cross the barrier to be in the Palestinian Legislative Council. And yet, although this movement, which is a democratic non-Hamas, non-Fatah movement, approves the PLO program, it was not accepted in the PLO also, although it applied for that since 3 years. So that means that it is a structure that is incapable of developing and opening up to other groups, which means that if we accept the results of the polls, probably the PLO is representing something a little bit less, a little bit more than 50% of the Palestinian population. And that is dangerous. It's dangerous in the long run, because that means that the whole role of the PLO could be influenced by the same factors that influence the Palestinian Authority. So that's why one of the major issues of talks that took place between different factions, and in which I was part of, a major emphasis was put on the issue of reactivation and revitalization of the PLO by incorporating everybody within it in accordance to a particular realistic program. That is one aspect of the matter. The other aspect of the matter is the relationship between the PLO and the authority. When Mr. Arafat was in charge and when he signed the Oslo Agreement, the process that was encouraged was to practically incorporate the whole PLO and its structure into the Palestinian Authority. And the PLO became nothing but a budget item in the financial budget of the Palestinian Authority, practically. And so the reference became part of the body that it was supposed to be governed by. And that, of course, weakened the PLO. When Hamas took over in the elections, Fatah remembered that there is a PLO, and so they decided now to reactivate it again and say that it is the source of authority. Now with a new Palestinian government, I see the opposite process happening again, which is where the PLO factions actually depend on the decision of Prime Minister Fayyad, whether they can get funding or not. So we're back into the process. This fluctuation, of course, leads to a very serious problem, and will eventually raise, I mean, this is like, if I may use medical terms, since I'm a medical doctor by education, it's like a disease that is starting. If you don't hit it in the beginning and use preventive measures, you will end up with a condition that is untreatable. And this was the case with the Palestinian Authority, and I'm worried that this could develop to become the case of the PLO unless immediate measures are taken. The meeting in Damascus is one effort from the side of Hamas and other groups in Damascus to undermine the legitimacy of the PLO, of course, and to create, they don't say so, they say they want to do this to consolidate unity. But again, this could become another blow to the unity of Palestinians and another factor of division. I will end by mentioning only one last sentence, which is that I know that maybe many academics don't believe in this anymore, and look at Palestinians as an authority only or as a bureaucratic structure. But there is really something called that when people are oppressed and under occupation, they search for a national liberation movement. And the PLO has been successful not because it was elected. It was successful because for a very long period of time, it managed to be the representative of Palestinian liberation movement for freedom. As long as it doesn't regain that status in one way or another, it could lose its role. And vacuum, nature doesn't accept vacuum. And so it will try to find a way of reflecting these intentions and these demands on the Palestinian side.
Yes, in the middle, toward the back. Jerry, yeah.
Yep. Jerry Serrata. I was very impressed by the clarity of Professor Saig's analysis. I'm wondering if it has practical implications if it were accepted, and is it possible that it is accepted in various sectors of the Palestinian society? Namely, we're not talking about a proto-state or a state in formation, but already the experience is one of a failed state. There was some talk about this after June that the government would not reform in Ramallah, but would in fact declare itself to be a failed state and put itself at the mercy, one might say, or ask for international intervention as a means of moving this off dead center. It's very difficult to say such a thing with the most prominent Democrat, Dr. Barghouti, in our presence, but might that be a change of vision that would enable any international conference to take up this issue from a different place? Perhaps looking at the situation, this is 60 years since the partition resolution, that this is an international problem because of the failed state of Palestine.
I mean, I'm not sure what to say more, really. Hypothetically, the intelligent thing, I suppose, given the failure of local systems and structures, would be for the international community to take over, administer, run things, rebuild. But that would mean, of course, taking direct physical control of the territory, which means, of course, shunting the Israelis aside as well, not to mention dealing with people taking pot shots at international mediators and all the rest. From the Palestinian side, I just don't see any of that. And as I was arguing earlier, there are things that could have happened 6 years ago or 10 years ago that are no longer possible now. I mean, the sort of intervention, financial, political, even military, if you like, that would have to be undertaken by an intervening party, if you're to compare with Somalia or Bosnia or Kosovo or anywhere else, as other examples. The scale and scope of what would have to be done now to bring things under control is beyond, the reason, the ability, and willpower of any particular party I can think of in the international community. I just don't see it coming together, and I can't translate it into practical policy proposals. There's one or two principles, the key one being, I was arguing earlier, that really the international community needs, above all else, to establish clear political benchmarks of behavior and action for the two main parties. And if it's not going to uphold those strictly, then we go nowhere. I mean, that's a starting point. It doesn't get us all that further, but and that partly means really, at the very least, establishing, or if you like, shifting back from this talk we hear so often, and Condi Rice said it just the other day, about offering a horizon. We don't need a horizon. We want to go back to something like the Clinton parameters of December 2000. Never mind what the specific history was at the time, but if the international community would at least commit itself very clearly, unequivocally, saying no matter what the various parties do in the meantime, whether it takes 20 or 30 years or whatever, we will not accept an end outcome, however it comes about, that departs significantly from many of these clear parameters. And whatever you do in the meantime is null and void. And you spend $10 billion building settlements, that's your tough luck. We're not going to bail you out later on. And if you engage in violence and shoot yourself in the foot, like Palestinians have done, then we're not bailing you out either. I mean, anything that is clear-cut, unequivocal, doesn't shift, and that is applied to both sides, the tiger-sheep analogy. Frankly, I think beyond setting very broad sort of guidelines or principles of this sort, in honesty, I don't really see what the international community can do at this point. I mean, in a way, I'm not letting anyone off the hook, but I'm not sure what the US administration could do now, at this stage in the game, that will fundamentally alter things. I think everyone has failed. I don't really see what more they can do in practical terms. We all want to do good. We want to inject money, try and rebuild institutions, get the economy going. Take the case of the agreement on movement and access that was negotiated, with Condoleezza Rice's mediation between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority in 2005. James Wolfensohn, ex-president of the World Bank, as quartet envoy, was very deeply engaged and shunted aside at the last minute. The agreement was critical. I think it was important. It reflected a flawed assumption, in my view, but nonetheless, it was an attempt by the international community to breathe life into its strategy since 1993, which is inject a lot of money into the place, get the private sector going, increase exports, increase growth, generate jobs, and we'll deal with the politics later, or at least we'll allow the two sides to deal with the politics, right? And after the Gaza disengagement, this seemed the right moment to relaunch the economic growth strategy. So we got a very detailed agreement on movement and access, which was about bus and truck convoys going from Gaza to the West Bank, about allowing agricultural produce from Gaza during harvest time to leave Gaza, about increasing trade, the number of trucks for export purposes and commercial import and export to increase from sort of whatever it was, 15 a day to 150 and then 400 within the year. Not a single thing was implemented by the government of Israel. I mean, I'm not being a propagandist here. You go to the World Bank, which was monitoring all this and dealing with it and acting as the coordinator and secretariat for all this, and they put it in black and white as zero implementation. James Wolfensohn came out at the end of his mission, which was 1st of May 2006, and while blaming various things on the Palestinians, said there's been a complete failure and this is due to systematic violation of undertakings by the government of Israel. All right. This non-political, security-based economic plan, the strategy, was allowed by the international community to fail. In May, just before the events of Gaza in June, the American side came along through Keith Dayton and Secretary Rice and presented a draft suggestion of an accelerated benchmarks for implementation of the agreement, which the Israeli security establishment immediately howled about and said, no, this just opens us up to terrorism. And so, if the international community cannot even get an increase in the number of trucks exporting goods in and out of Gaza going, even before Hamas came to power, what practical proposals may I suggest that the international community take on board?
May I just add one element, please? If I understood your question correctly, I think the issue of failed state has two dimensions. One dimension is relates to the fact that Palestinian Authority is not a state. So you cannot judge what happened in the West Bank as a failure of the state building, because the PA did not have the components of a state. And what is happening now is so much of a déjà vu. We've been there so many times, and each time there was a failure because the structure itself lacks the basic elements of success. Just an example, they're talking about an industrial park in Jericho that would be supported by Japan. At the same time, when farmers in one village called Tubas cannot sell their tomato in Nablus, which is a nearby city, because of the checkpoints. I mean, how can we speak about a failure of the state? There was no state to fail. The second aspect of your question, which is I think Saeed was very much interested in, was the issue if this process that is happening on the ground, and I hope I'm not pessimistic to say that it has already surpassed the point of return, if the situation on the ground continues to destroy the option of two states, then what is the solution? I think Condoleezza Rice is quite right when she said just recently, a few days ago, that there is an imminent danger, risk, that the two states option could vanish. And if that is the case, then what is the solution? Would Israel want to have Palestinians and Israelis in one state solution? I wouldn't mind to have one state with democratic rights, one vote, one person, fine. But is that what Israel wants? What the world community must see in this case is that it is actually an Israeli decision, whether to have two states or one state. But to think, just to think, that apartheid on the ground is something that would last is only a wrong thinking, because we, as Palestinians, will not accept to continue to be slaves of occupation. This will not happen.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. I want to thank, on behalf of Rob, Khalil, Mustafa, and Yazid for